like I'm going to pay attention to that. All right, so just as you read the terms and conditions of this next little thing that we're going to do, I want to bring something to your attention. So the King's Head has been kind enough to sponsor a 24-ounce beer, beautiful beer, and it's going to be on sale for, what is it, like $9 with a $1 donation to the Canadian Cyber Defense Challenge. So please drink responsibly, and drink often. Really appreciate that. So a little bit about me. I've kind of been in InfoSec on the periphery here in Winnipeg, the Tatooine of IT security, as it will. I haven't joined the empire like Google. Is that how you say it? The Google? Anyways, I do all sorts of weird stuff. A lot of it is around cyber threat intelligence, which I'm going to talk to you guys about, and you might understand what the hell that is. But a lot of it has to do with my background, which is an intelligence operator for the Canadian Forces, and then more recently some work in RCMP criminal intelligence. And this is all about what the bad guys are going to do to you when they get a hold of you. So, I got a company. As most of you in the audience have, it's kind of an IT security backup plan for if you get into trouble with HR like I do. And you may find yourself looking for a new job. Well, it's great to have your own company to go to. These are some of the people that we work with and stuff like that. You know, we would be lost without Skullspace and all the people here, and we've contracted services to Skullspace members for all the crazy stuff we've done. And as we go through this presentation, you'll get an idea about why IT security is a really big thing, and one person cannot know everything, and if somebody stands up here and says they're an expert, they can go fuck themselves. So there's an agenda, there's lots of stuff we're going to talk about. So one of the things is looking out on the landscape. It's a situation that's really in flux. I mean, every day you look and you see a new article in The Guardian or Der Spiegel about, you know, Snowden and his revelations and shit like that. So it becomes a really important moment in time because our world that we live in, as, you know, I'm preaching to the converted here, but we're under constant surveillance. And all those people that came up to me at DEF CON in 1999 when I first started going and said, you know, the US government is listening to all the shit that I say and it's tracking me on the internet. Yeah, I apologize to those people because I blew them off. I thought they were crazy. They were right. So, and we live in a world where there's autonomous killing robots that look more like Farmville animals flying around the skies of Pakistan. But the reality is that James Cameron's vision is like with us here, so we got some problems. And our problems start back here in Canada and Edward Snowden, because apparently with a USB stick you can be a hacker, according to the media, which is good because I can claim that title because I know how to use a USB stick, so that's pretty cool. I just actually put up this little thing about the guy that ran the cyber weapons program for Iran. And I'm going to kind of rag on Iran a little bit through this presentation because I don't like them. But the point is that this is an Iranian performance review where you get 2 in the chest. And I think the issue here is that Iran is a country that is like their new president, Hamadi, wants to kind of get back with the US. So he probably went to the cyber weapons program guy and said, listen, man, you know what? You guys are tearing some shit up at the American banks, so I'd like you to stop. And he's like, no can do, bro. So yeah, so his performance review didn't work out too well. So, you know, between Delisle and Snowden, we've seen a lot of things, and it's sort of like great for Canada in a lot of respects, but kind of shitty for the United States' economy. One of the things that we talk about in cyber threat intelligence is the cost to the business. So right now, if you're an American cloud services provider, you're just waiting for the next shoe to drop, right? Every time there's a revelation that, you know, something has gone wrong, and all of a sudden, you know, there's this revelation, and like people don't want to buy your shit anymore. So this is great for Canada because we're looked at right now as being kind of fluffy and kind of cool, and maybe not as, you know, focused on surveillance as we think. But one of the things that did happen is it's really sent the bad guys out there, the terrorists, sent them underground. They are not using the internet anymore for their communications as a result of the revelations of John Snowden, or Eric Snowden, or his brother Edward Snowden. Somebody named Snowden. So in Canada, man. So Canada is like viewed as this country where it's like, we don't have a cyber problem per se, but you know, if I reach out to the audience right now, quick individual poll, who here has suffered a credit card fraud issue, identity theft, or something related to that? Show of hands. Okay, and thank you for the people that are being honest and the rest of you guys who didn't put up your hand just because you're too cool for school. I understand that, but most of us have. And what was really interesting to me is this report came out from Trusteer that talked about, you know, Canada being this haven of cybercrime and stuff like that. And then I kind of called them on it. I went, I said, what was your methodology? What did you guys look for in terms of the indicators? And the only thing was nothing was footnoted in the report, and it was like the Trusteer Research Group. Okay, well, do you guys sell security products? Is there a possibility here that this is more marketing? So, you know, being a little bit of a social engineer and a guy that has been involved in law enforcement and the military, you can get a lot of great information out of our government if you play their game. If you go to them and you say, listen, man, I want to refute some of the arguments that is going on, you know, here about Canada being a haven of cybercrime. So can you give me some data? Well, what's interesting is that we've had like 6,626 incidents about reported cybercrime in Canada in 2010. And this was because in 2008, they actually added a flag to something called UCR, which is the Uniform Crime Reporting thing. And you click a flag if it's cybercrime. And I mean, the stats are kind of interesting, but what really blew me away is the assault level 1, there's 20 that were flagged as cybercrime. Like, is somebody getting beaten to death with a laptop or what the fuck? But the one thing we have in the criminal code is like luring a child via computer, and we have 466 incidents, which in my estimation is like 466 way too many. But what was interesting is in Winnipeg here we had like 88 incidents called like flagged cybercrime. So I guess, you know, when the cops pull you over and you've got like a dead hooker and guns and a bunch of coke and a bunch of credit cards that were stolen, they don't really flag it as cybercrime. So it all really depends. It's very situational it's very situational. But if we look down and we break down and we take a look at the luring the child by the computer, we see that there are actually charges. There are actually people going to jail for this. And that's kind of cool. The problem is, though, that they've changed the criminal code a little bit and introduced actual cyber crime, as you will, charges. And so far, between Mafia Boy and a 14-year-old dude who ripped apart the Quebec government website, those are the only two people that have been charged with true cybercrime in Canada. So maybe we could be doing a little bit better job there. So I went and I shout out to Karen from Securus. She's awesome. She sent me a real report with some like real data, which we could get our teeth into. And the stats are really not good. A couple things that we really suck at right now is stuff around risk management and stuff around like having a plan for when things go sideways in your organization. So that was one of the things that really came out of this report. And we had a 13-page guide to a cybersecurity plan that the federal government put out, and like 7% of businesses are aware of it. So that's a little bit of a problem. So, you know, what I'm trying to say right now here, and to sum up in this particular piece, is that, you know, we've got some problems. And one of the things is that due to a crack-smoking mayor, a major bust that went down in Canada never really got into the media at all. And it was interesting that Europol, who is kind of like Interpol's intelligence group, they basically threw out this that talked about this major credit card ring that was busted, a whole bunch of Canadians working out of Montreal, Canada. And it's like, wow, who knew, right? It's interesting because if we go back to that slide with the stats on it, Montreal's at like kind of or Quebec is at kind of the top of the list in terms of cybercrime. So that was kind of the introduction to the threat landscape, if you will, and what's going on. And we're going to talk a little bit about my giant data. And we're going to talk a little bit about how big data and analytics and all that kind of stuff work together. So a lot of this is important because we're sort of now seeing a a tremendous amount of data about you and what you do and where you go and kind of the things that you like on Facebook or Amazon.com, this kind of stuff you buy. There are more insidious missions that big data can accomplish. And what I'm going to introduce you today in this presentation is some of the more insidious uses of big data and what some of the governments are doing. So as you can imagine, as a result of some of the revelations of Mr. Snowden, the NSA has a bit of a problem. And the NSA is really having a difficult time with this domestic spying thing because what they were really good at doing is killing terrorists. And they were really good at like killing them and by gathering all their communications data. And one of the things that they would do is identify the phones and the satellite phones and the text messages and the emails, and they would build up an analytical picture of the communications network and then exploit that. And they usually exploited it by these giant vehicles flying around and delivering the cell phone bill with a very large missile. You'll notice that it's pretty interesting that we started really with 2002 and we had a lot of intelligence gathering on where the bad guys were. And then we transitioned to outright elimination of the bad guys. Shitty if you're a bad guy, and apparently getting promoted right now in the Taliban is not a good thing. You can hear the guys overhead. A lot of these dudes that they wiped out were like settling the score. In fact, one of the last dudes was involved in the USS Cole bombing. So America never forgets. It's like a giant elephant, only with missiles and shit. So one of the cool companies that are out there is Netflix, and I want to talk to you because like big data is like ethically ambiguous, right? It's all about what you use it for. And Netflix is kind of cool because they don't own any of their own infrastructure. They actually are Amazon's biggest customer, and they do a lot of really cool analytical stuff. What they do is they basically can analyze the eyeballs that are watching their shows, and they have some of the best analytics, and then they will physically move those shows closer to you in a data center to reduce latency. And what's really interesting is Netflix and the Obama campaign worked hand in hand because the tools that Netflix uses for big data, they lent to the Obama campaign so that when that giant hurricane of ending the Republican even contention of Mitt Romney was heading towards the coast there, they had moved all of their servers and all of the provisioning using Netflix's tools over to West Coast data centers, very close to where Ron Bose is going to end up. And yeah, I just want to point out how much data they do have is like 6.3 years of stuff. So when I was with the RCMP and the Criminal Intelligence Unit, what we would do is we would take data and we would try and like decipher it. So my first assignment kind of looked like this. And this is a giant hairball of a whole bunch of people involved in, potentially involved in the drug trade in Manitoba. And what this is a visual representation of all their Facebook friends. And what we did is we combined that with all the data that we had in terms of interactions with the police. And this was a really interesting project because this was the first time we took freely available social networking data, and then we combined it with our proprietary data that we had about those interactions in the police. So that yielded what I like to call the wheel of dirtbags. And the thing about the wheel of dirtbags is that it uses math. And math is kind of awesome because when you go to court, one of the things that wins is math and evidence. But math really is more important. And what we found is a dude who was involved in this whole nest of really not nice people. We found a dude that we, as the police at the time, knew nothing about. So this was really kind of cool. But what I thought was really more interesting was what would happen if you were, for instance, a CIA intelligence operative and the bad guys had access to these tools and they could out you as a agent working undercover in that organization. So it really goes both ways, right? When I posed that question, I got a lot of like, hey, so I hear the private consulting world is a really interesting place to be. So here's an interesting diagram, and this is all about your relationships. This is 2005 Fallujah, and what you're seeing in front of you here is a whole bunch of cell phones. And it's pretty evident where you can find the command and control nodes. If I had a laser pointer or something cool like that, I'd show you. But you see these big clusters of all sorts of dudes, and then you see this one black line to like a center control node. So this was something that the US government utilized in order to clamp down on the insurgency inside Fallujah that was going on. And you can well imagine that once you own the phones, and we're going to talk about some of those US government programs that we know about, but once you own the phones, you kind of own the person. And if you've enabled location services on your phone, bad things are going to fucking happen to you. So one of the things that the United States ran into was a DAA program where they would map and ask a whole bunch of analytical questions from a whole bunch of different databases. And I kind of adopted this because I really wanted to show the difference between Canada and the United States. And it really comes down to this. In Canada, you have a charter right to privacy. In the United States, you don't. And the result is that if a government or agency were to do this to you, they would go to jail for a very long time. In the United States, that's not the case. So what they would do is they would look at all these different databases and they ask some analytical questions about the cost of the house that you live in and what your income was and what kind of fancy cars you drove and if you had any interaction with the police before or the courts or a whole bunch of different questions around your credit rating and stuff like that. And they'd suck that information from all those different databases into central databases. And then they'd score you as a dirtbag, right? And if you made the score, then you would attract the attention of various law enforcement agents. All totally illegal in Canada, but all kind of what has been uncovered by this surveillance state that we live in. And then what would happen is that information would be fed into other databases that are more proprietary, those are the ones in red, where you basically can gain additional insight to those person's activities. And then finally you go into the green area, which requires a warrant for information about that person, such as their Facebook profiles, social networking. At the end of the day, what you have is enough circumstantial evidence to convince a judge who's not very well educated on the subject that your suspect requires further scrutiny. And so this is what the United States has basically involved itself in by gathering this information directly. This becomes really kind of scary. From the perspective of a person who is just trying to exist in this connected world, making wrong choices about your friends, your associates, and the occasional drunken text message that you send can have really big implications. So you get things like guilty by association, relentless marketing, and minority report law enforcement. And this is where I really want to talk about the ethical importance of analyzing big data. It comes down to this. The questions that you ask big data, you need to be prepared for the answers that you're going to get back. So, when you look at using big data, and a great example is in Haiti when they had that giant earthquake, they used big data analysis of all the cell phones, and they were able to overlay cell phones that hadn't moved for 24 hours in order to figure out whether or not there were people maybe trapped in collapsed buildings. So they could overlay that using GIS so that they could take recent satellite survey maps, map cell phones onto that, and then show the ones that hadn't moved for 24 hours. So kind of cool stuff. One of the scariest sort of big data things that I saw was at DEF CON this year about Hyperion Gray and his research. And as soon as I saw his presentation, I was like, why aren't you in jail? The Americans Computer Fraud and Abuse Act is pretty specific on what you can and cannot do. This dude has basically adapted giant amounts of cluster servers in order to map out and then exploit countries. So he's pen testing countries. Really interesting to me, and I thought, okay, what was going on? So I reached out to a few of my contacts on LinkedIn. Turns out this is a DARPA startup. So the American government is sending a very clear message that if you fuck with us, we are going to come at you and you are not going to like what we're going to do to your network at all. So really interesting stuff that is going on there. And then there's some other sort of more independent research by a guy named Chimo Alonso, and Chimo and I have gone way back together. He is an amazing dude. He built a tool called FOCA, which basically analyzes metadata from every document that is ever put up on the website. And this is a great side channel attack into an organization to analyze the data that that organization is producing. So if you're putting stuff up on the web and you're not scrubbing it for things like user IDs and SQL Server IP addresses and things like that, you could be revealing an awful lot about you. And Chimo's latest tool is a man-in-the-middle attack for IPv6, IPv4, and it's called DEF CON Evil FOCA, the DEF CON edition. You should check that out because he is doing some amazing research. And he's Spanish, so he's kind of lazy. So his whole tool is drag and drop. So for those people, not Theo Durat, but for those people that really enjoy GUIs, it's some really cool stuff. So we come around here to the big question, which is how does this big data inform our analytics in terms of cyber threat analysis? What's really interesting is that if you're trying to understand a business and you're trying to understand what they're doing, you have an awful lot of IT security tools to do that. Everything from the I2 diagrams that I showed you, if you're hunting insurgents, I don't know how many people you guys are doing that, and insurgents are not necessarily users, but you know, depending on your relationship with your business, you might want to call them that. But we have lots of tools, and we have lots of tools that deal with big data, and I'll give you a few examples of that in a moment, but it's time for the mandatory shot break. And I just want to introduce Rainbow and Pony, my two interns, and they're really awesome, and I'm allowed to call them Rainbow and Pony when they're not actually here. That's according to my HR people. Cheers. Jägermeister. So here's an example of sort of a big data analysis and what we do in cyber threat analysis. We install Wireshark, and then we send a giant bill to our companies for that. But no, we install Wireshark, and we look at the outbound wet network traffic. And some of the times we see some really interesting stuff. So in this example, we're seeing a connection being made out of your network to Pakistan. And if there's no compelling business reason for transmitting packets to Pakistan, this is usually known in IT circles, IT security circles, as a problem. So what we want to do is figure out what's going on. So we ask a bunch of questions. And we take our traffic and we kind of run it through a scenario, and we see that, you know, what happened is the payroll clerk, she clicked on a PDF, probably a picture of a cat, and you know, now we have outbound connections from our network to Pakistan. And that's not good, that's not desirable. So in some ways, what I'm telling you is that you're using your big data, you're using your network analysis, you're using your tools to understand where things are at in your network. And I've got some rules that'll kind of help you guys out as we move forward. Whoops. So bottom line here is that in small, medium business, it's pretty easy to determine what is legitimate traffic and what isn't based on what that business requirements are. So if you're in a scenario where you're, you know, protecting a small, medium business and you notice that there's a whole bunch of outbound traffic to like China or Russia, that's probably an indicator, especially if the humans are gone for the day and that traffic is still there, that's probably an indicator that something not cool is going on. And when I say something not cool, there are a number of threat actors out there that fall into the not cool category. These are some dudes who have ripped apart networks. And what we're really seeing in the cyber threat landscape right now is data destruction, and ransomware. And I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about CryptoLocker, but we'll get into that in a moment. But basically what we're seeing is burning American flags on computers that even after you call the help desk and they tell you to reboot, the burning American flag is still there. So we're seeing a lot of interesting malware that's coming at us that is all about breaking your stuff. In the Saudi Amoco attack, you're talking about 30,000 bricked computers. In South Korean corporations, we're talking about 35,000 computers that were bricked in the financial industry. It's estimated that it cost the South Koreans about a couple $1 billion as it shut down their trading systems and their financial systems for about 4 days while they unfucked themselves. The interesting thing about the Jacora malware and the analysis that's been done is there's actual Android code in this malware. And that's a little bit concerning in that one of the possible vectors of attack was some dude jonesing for a charging that took his personal Android phone and plugged it in to a banking computer in South Korea, thus enabling the malware to cross over from a wireless network into a secure data network. So that's a little bit difficult to deal with. And as we talked about the cyber fighters of Izzy el-Din al-Qassam, al-Qassam is also what the Hezbollah call their armed brigades, so we're pretty much sure who these guys belong to. They're probably the fat ones that aren't good at running and shooting. But anyways, those guys have been tearing some shit up on the internet. We're going to talk about them. The comment group, well known, also the Elderwood Gang. These are Chinese espionage crews that are pretty sophisticated. And the Syrian Electronic Army, who I have a personal relationship with, which we're going to get into. So, yeah, Al-Qassam, with many Allah Akbars, because that's kind of their methodology, these are the thugs of the internet right now who basically target American financial critical infrastructure. They are targeting it because of perceived outrage over a really crappy film that was released on YouTube about like the innocence of Muslims. And basically America trolled Iran and then got owned, seriously owned. The result was that the US government was compelled to release a whole bunch of cyber threat intelligence information, of which I managed to social engineer myself into by signing up for a DHS feed on this stuff. And it was really interesting because these guys are basically thugs. They're launching denial of service attacks. And many of you have probably witnessed the power of a denial of service attack, but these are in the order of like 50 to 60 gigs per second. So an awful lot of attacks that are flattening networks. So they're a pretty serious threat. And you know, just to give you an idea, in 2007, one of the things we talk about was the Estonian cyber attacks and how that entire country got owned by the Russians. This was an order of magnitude about 3 times the traffic. So they're up to some pretty serious shit. The Syrian Electronic Army is, I'm going to say, more ninja-like in terms of its approach. These guys are not thugs. They actually have some talent. They seem to be made up of also social engineers, gifted social engineers that have been ripping apart the internet by you know, sending things like faxes to DNS registrars to change who owns the DNS. Like, holy crap. What an interesting side channel attack, because, you know, oh, it's an email and it seems to be from somebody sketchy, but it's a fax. So yeah, absolutely, I should, you know, totally change that DNS registrar over to Muhammad@Muhammad.com. What could possibly go wrong? Couple of interesting attacks recently on Haifa's critical infrastructure, and also, I don't know if you saw, you may follow me, you may not, but there was, I put up a LinkedIn post about a attack on a tunnel, if you can believe it. Like, who puts an IP address on a tunnel? That doesn't sound like a good thing, especially one without a firewall, Jesus. Anyways, they turned the red lights on in both directions in this bidirectional tunnel, right? And, you know, so not really what I call a sophisticated cyber attack. I guess, you know, they were out of late model Toyota Corollas leaning to one side with somebody really motivated and very sweaty at the driver wheel. But anyways, so they shut down this tunnel in Haifa, and it really kind of shocked me and said, like, oh my God, like maybe, you know, you might want to buy something from Palo Alto and put that in front of your VPN connection or something like that. But one of the things that they did do is they kind of like trolled the United States into thinking that there was this cyber attack on the White House, and as a result of that, the S&P 500 index like totally plunged. So one of the things that big data tells us is about who's inside your network, and it's a lot of it has to do with the types of attacks and how they're getting in. This is from the Verizon Data Breach Report, and it has some really great data, and I would point you in that direction. If you're working in business or you're a consultant or something like that, maybe have a look at some of the threat actors. I mean, right now, CryptoLocker is ripping apart the internet, and apparently the success rate is near 10%. Apparently, police forces all over the world are embracing UCash as a way to pay your fines for illegal material that may be found on your computer. So it seems to be pretty lucrative for them. In fact, they might be involved in this due to the budget constraints that are going on. Our neighbors to the south are a little bit dangerous, and unfortunately, so one of the, I'm going to say, failures of just geo-IP blocking would be that, you know, we actually have to interact with our largest trading partners. So, but what's interesting is if there's no compelling business reason to accept packets from places like Russia and China, why do you? And maybe there is a business argument that suggests that leaving your VPN ports and your Outlook web access ports open to every single person on the internet, including the Syrian douchebags that we're going to talk about in a little bit, is not maybe the best business decision ever. And one of our major problems in info security, and I'm sure a lot of people can commiserate, is people keep clicking on shit. And that is a huge problem. And in fact, 91% of your attacks are people click on shit. So I get paid a lot of money to tell businesses, stop clicking on shit. And thank you, here's my giant bill. But one of the things that you know, gets me every time is side boob searches. And then stuff comes up, I click on it, and you know, I'm owned. So it's one of the reasons we need cyber threat intelligence is that the last RSA conference, it didn't look really good about antivirus or our expensive IPS IDSs and or our firewalls. In fact, most of this shit is sailing straight through it. So one of the things that we can do is figure out a way to maybe grab a hold of the business and figure out a way to mitigate that threat. And here's some rules that I want to walk you guys through. So there needs to be a business reason for every packet that's coming into your and leaving your network. And if you see traffic that doesn't make any business sense, you maybe want to stop it, okay? People do not need the weather bug application. You know, they need to like not have that. So that's something you need to stop. We lost the battle for the desktop quite some time ago. So really now we need to work at the DMZ and we need to look at the traffic that's going inbound and outbound. And we need to have visibility on that. And right now, if you're monitoring a network or you're looking at a network or you're trying to, you know, secure a network and you're not looking at the traffic that's going in and out of it, you're missing the show. One of the best ways to look at traffic is to kill all your users or let them go home for the weekend. And then look at the traffic coming out of your network. And if you're seeing connections that are outbound to God knows where, and there are no humans, then you need to ask some serious questions about what's going on in your environment. And this is how we're detecting advanced persistent threats. And I'm going to walk you guys through, you know, kind of a way to look at that. But you know, the two rules come down and are really interesting. They're not InfoSec rules per se. They're more about the realities of business, okay? And business makes decisions. And as IT security, we can be influencers to that business to a certain extent, but a lot of the times we just have to suck it up and bend over, okay? And the business will come at us and they'll say, we want an HR portal. And we're like, oh, that's really cool. So people are gonna upload their resumes to that. And you're like, yeah. And then it's gonna go into a database. Yeah. And then HR people are going to like open those resumes and look at them. Yeah. What could possibly go wrong with that scenario, right? Are we really going to set up a system that allows anybody in the world unauthenticated to upload a Word document? That doesn't sound like a good idea. So there is a whole bunch of work that we can do as IT security that kind of surrounds and encompasses that whole aspect to IT security, and that is work with the business. We have to have those communication skills. Like I was totally shitty at communication until recently when my income, it was related to communication skills, and then I suddenly found myself vastly improved. So a couple of government projects to be aware of, and this is kind of like an interesting delve into where the Americans kind of see themselves, is the fact that right now, there are a lot of talk about the NSA and some of the programs that they're involved in, and they're basically going after routers. They're going after routers because routers are awesome, and people don't patch them, and they have like vulnerabilities. If you watch the US CERT feeds, there's a ton of iOS problems and exploits and vulnerabilities. But what's really important is that they're using this and they're leveraging this to do their global surveillance mission, and they've put a lot of money on that thing. 85,000 implants talks about implanting malware into routers that are gateways to possibly several larger networks. Okay, and a recent revelation is that the Belgian telecom, Belgco, or Belge Telco, they were owned, and they found malware in their routers, and they found malware in the specific switches and routers that are used to route transatlantic cable, because it turns out that a whole bunch of African ISPs use this Belgian telco as their a demarc point for their fiber coming out of the Middle East. And there have been a number of scenarios in recent months and over the last year that have involved transatlantic or trans-Mediterranean cable outages. And this may be as a result of some of the activity of some of the groups that we're going to talk about in a little bit. But when you talk about the communications medium and that abstract idea of sending data between countries, it is all being done digitally. And the result of that digital intercept capability creates vast amounts of data in an organization. God, I'm getting thirsty. Cheers. So one of the things that we talk about is, what is the NSA actually doing? And turns out that they're doing quite a bit in the war on terrorism. They are embedding themselves in sort of the US military's operational level capability, and they are working hand in hand with special people, not special people wearing helmets, but I guess in this case they are wearing helmets, they just have guns. And so they're doing some really cool shit, like sending text messages about maybe meeting up and talking about some stuff like maybe some bombs. And as a result of those sort of spoofed text messages, these dudes will show up for a meeting, and it's not really a friendly reception that they get. It's actually kind of tragic for them. But what's really interesting is that this tactic has worked considerably well. And in 2005, during the Battle of Fallujah, they were able to, the NSA was able to spoof the bad guys' communications network. In fact, they totally owned it. And what was really interesting is they didn't turn it off to make communications worse. They actually enhanced it. They enhanced it by having real-time translators to do voice translation of what was going on. So they would make fake phone calls, they would send fake text messages, they would fake emails and stuff like that to get people to be available targets for the US Air Force. So kind of a neat thing. So we bring to one of the most shady groups that's out there, and they're called Task Force Orange. And these guys are the guys that are responsible for basically tapping into shit. They will go into other countries, they will dig holes in the ground, they will tap fiber optic cables. They do this especially in, I'm going to say, countries of interest to the United States. So it is very likely, although I have no hard data to support this, but it is very likely that the entire Syrian infrastructure has been mapped out as well as intercepted, in case we might get into a fisticuff about that, with them. There are many, many programs buried under programs, and actually from my own military experience, I understand why we continually rename programs and kind of change the letterhead and stuff like that. It's so that if citizens actually make Freedom of Information Act requests, we can say, oh, data on that program no longer exists. So you get to try and pick which program it's actually under when you make your Freedom of Information Act request, and we make it more difficult by changing the name every 6 months. But interestingly enough, the data that is being collected on the bad guys has been done both autonomously and then with actual human intelligence. Because when you think about it, IP addresses are one thing, but if you can trace the IP address to a human actor, you now are in a scenario where you can identify who that person is. You can possibly leverage or turn them, but you could also terminate them with their last bill, as it were, just probably as they load it up on their minutes for their cell phone. This is being used not just in a counterterrorism process, but also against counter-narcotics. The Project Ecuador, or Program Ecuador as it's called, we know about this as a result of job advertisements that the US Navy put out for network exploitation experts. And interestingly enough, they sail around in submarines off the coast of various Caribbean nations that might have a cavalier attitude towards things like cocaine. And they will eavesdrop on everything that's going on. And by eavesdrop, they will launch malware attacks on that infrastructure, and they will attempt to dismantle various criminal organizations involved in the drug trade. And what's very interesting to me is that this is combined with drone activity in terms of surveillance, as well as integrating the US Coast Guard capability in terms of ground surveillance radar. So they've actually had a lot of success taking these very, I'm going to say, aggressive military tactics and applying them to the, I'm going to say, the semi-legal, the semi-non-legal application in terms of counter-narcotics activity. The interesting thing to see is the relationship between the US Navy and the NSA. The US Navy was basically, I'm going to say, the big stepsister to the NSA. The NSA has now, grown up, gotten married, and gotten a shit ton of money. And as a result of that, they run their own platforms ranging from aircraft to surveillance. The NSA are the custodians of big data in the United States. Make no mistake about that. And again, what we're talking about in the US right now is about the issue of, what level of surveillance is required based on privacy. What has come back is really interesting. There are the ACLU and the EFF who are having kittens over this, mostly because they feel it's a giant invasion of privacy, which I think they're correct on, but because it has undone judicial privilege in the United States. The only people that you can't subpoena are lawyers. Lawyers have to take what you tell them in confidence to the grave. If you chose to do that via a text message or an email or even a voice conversation, there's a very good chance that that was intercepted by the US government. The result has been legal action taken by the ACLU and the EFF that would suggest that they have violated judicial privilege, which is the only, I'm going to say, overarching law of the land. So this is a very interesting scenario that the United States finds themselves in, and it's basically comes down to this. If you're accused of something criminal and the government has evidence that suggests that you're innocent, and the government fails to disclose that information, based on the reasonable doubt provisions, you should go free. So there are a number of court cases now that have gone to the United States courts and courts of appeal because of the United States surveillance apparatus, where various people have suggested that the government knows that they're innocent and has evidence that would exonerate them. So the next shoe to drop is in the United States legal system, the next shoe to drop is really about what does the government know about you, and can I use that as evidence to, in my own defense? And that is a huge question that the lawyers are going to have to figure out. So one of the things that big data has kind of shown us is that we have a number of different attack vectors, and they really seem to follow themes. Giant events that happen in the world, like the Royal Baby or the Boston Marathon bombings, or recently the earthquake that happened, or the tsunami that happened in the Philippines. Typhoon, right? Thanks. The typhoon that happened is now being used as a leverage for cyber criminals. And also foreign intelligence services to try and get inside your network by sending enticing emails about supporting the poor people that basically lived on a spit of land and got totally obliterated. That is a problem. We have some historical fights that have been going on since 2000 when Palestinian students and Israeli students had it out over the conflict over the internet, and were attacking university servers and defacing web pages and things like that. So we're seeing a lot of trends that can help a business. Now, some of them don't apply to your business, But if you're dealing with a business that has maybe a branch office in these other countries, it's something to be aware of because it's really going to inform what's going to happen next. So I'm going to walk you through right now what kind of a cyber attack looks like. I'm going to take you sort of through how the United States aggressive methodology as well as military operations translate into network exploitation. So we have a dude here that we don't like very much. He's kind of a bad dude. And I just want to point out that his 40 gates were not sold by Securus. It's a very important point. But he is basically a pretty hardcore supporter of the Assad regime, and he's responsible for registering websites. And that's his LinkedIn profile and his email, so send him some shout-outs from BSides. I didn't find his Twitter, but whatever. But anyways, he's kind of a douchebag. And he's kind of involved in, monitoring and surveilling the Syrian rebels. And unfortunately, like in the United States, it usually doesn't end with 2 shots in the back of your head, but in Syria, it really does. And so we were able to gather a lot of intel on this dude and some of the networks that he's responsible for. And if you see the Google Maps there, the B there is his data center, and then A is the secret police headquarters, and there's apparently fiber that runs down that road. And we can't bomb it in the middle because there's like a mosque and a school for girls, so we don't want to do that. But basically, this is open source intelligence work. This is your first step in analyzing a dude that you kind of want to own. And then you fire up Nmap. And Nmap is awesome. And in fact, amongst some of the esteemed members of Skullspace, there may be 1 or 2 people that have contributed to Nmap, not myself. I rely on people that are way smarter than me. But what I can do is I can kind of show you that there are some targets that are kind of interesting inside that network. And what was really interesting to me is that when we ran the same scan from Chimo Alonso's proxy server in Morocco, we saw 300 targets. But these are the targets that are currently available in that subnet from North America in our IP address space. And what I found really interesting was the fact that these look like Vista boxes and 2008 boxes with some shitty firewalls in front of them that basically aren't scrubbing out these 4,000 ports. But what I found really interesting was the fact that there's some real-time streaming protocol ports that are open on these boxes, and the fact that, with a little work with the Google, you can find out the fact that there are some zero-day exploits for real-time streaming protocol. So if, for instance, I was running a cyber weapons operation, what I would do is say, I have some targets for you guys, and it seems like they're running some software on this port, so what I'd really like to do is maybe weaponize it a little bit, see some shit going on. So that was kind of an example of how you find the bad guys, and once you have some targets, you can turn it over to people way smarter than me and say, have at her. And I do have to send a shout out to some of the folks at Skullspace who have helped me out on doing some pen tests on some stuff, because it was really awesome. And Rainbow and Pony actually automated some pen tests for our clients. So that was really kind of cool. So let's talk about the future. The future is not good. We're going to see a lot of cloud-based attacks. We're going to see gigantic denial of service attacks. Obviously, exploitation of world events for kinetic enhancement, absolutely, definitely something that's coming on. And we're really seeing cross-platform attacks, wireless, cellular. At DEF CON this year, there was a femtocell that's like a mini cell tower that you hardcore hackers can get your hands on. That's a great platformer for a man in the middle. So if you can convince a cell phone to attach to your cell phone tower, you can do all sorts of fun shit with it. And what we're going to see is that nation states are finding that developing cyber warfare capability is like way cooler and way easier than doing anything else. What is that? This is probably the one slide that's kind of important to understand what the hell I've been talking about for the last 48 minutes here. But basically, it's an analytical process that we use in cyber threat intelligence. We identify your critical information. And my hint here is ask the business what is critical. Don't decide what is critical for that business. That's sort of the #1 thing that you can fuck up. Analyze your threats. Ask your friends, right? Especially in the skull space community, when you start talking about things like crypto, and you might want to talk to somebody that knows something about crypto instead of sounding like an idiot talking about crypto. It's a great idea to engage, some expert things. Analyze your vulnerabilities. Like a pen test is a really great way to template and start your journey of securing your environment. And then, look at your risk and always put dollars around risk. What happens if we lose, our systems to crypto locker? Do we have the money to pay the ransom? If we pay the ransom, what does that mean? If we can restore from backup, what does that mean in terms of downtime? Like, you really got to think about that and apply your countermeasures. And then I just kind of listed some of the things that we look at in terms of a business, right? So your current and future business plans, things like your passwords and your user ID cards and stuff like that. But what a lot of people overlook is those network architecture diagrams. Those are super important. And if I can get my hands on those, I can fuck up your shit, right? That becomes really important. So those documents about how your network is laid out and your security processes and procedures, they need to be secured. They shouldn't be on the share with like everyone permission and NTFS permissions for everyone. That's like a bad frickin' idea. So here's an example of global cyber threat analysis that you would do at a large organization to kind of spot whether or not you're owned. And it's really straightforward. So you hash everything, right, with a hash algorithm, okay? All your systems. What you're essentially looking for is a system that's not like the others. We're talking Sesame Street level cyber defense here, okay? You're looking for the thing that's different, right? Then what you're doing is you're going to say, okay, well, I have some analytics because I'm looking at all my traffic and I'm gathering it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put that system that is different with those analytics that I collected and, oh, shit, man, that system is talking to Russia. That's not a cool thing, right? And then excitement happens because that system is now different. And in IT security, we don't like different. Different is weird and awkward and kind of like me in HR when I saw that sexual harassment presentation and got erect. That was not a good thing. But anyways, what you have now is you have a data set that you can use to analyze your organization and say, you know what? Like, things should not be different, right? Things should be the same across all your organization. So when you find an extra executable called sketchy.exe, it's probably not something that you want in your organization. So one of the things that we have right now in cyber defense is we have a deficit of security. The fact that this isn't 3,000 people, it's 150 is a great start. But my fond wish would be to see BSides and this crew do 1,000 people in Western Canada for a conference because this is so needed. So some of the things that we've involved ourselves in is I've been embedded like an Alabama tick into a lot of organizations. IC2, Skull Space, the Canadian Cyber Defense Challenge, which is kind of my pet project. You need to become more involved. You need to mentor the next generation that's coming up. It's vital, it's important, and we, all of us in this room, have a collective responsibility to guard the way of life that we have and the things that we hold precious and dear. Because, we can call Batman, but he may not take our call. One of the things that we need to do is we need to grab a hold of those young professionals and we need to help them. Maybe I'm not the best mentor for that, but we need to help them work through the process. There's been some really cool stuff happen at Skull Space where vulnerabilities have been discovered, and we have walked through that responsible disclosure. And in one case, it was kind of like we, finger banged their cat when we told them that they had a vulnerability. They were not happy about it at all, refused to comment, and then didn't take my calls afterwards. In another case, we got locked on to a really tremendous resource who is working really hard to take the information that we have, work with the vendor, and coordinate a response. So it was phenomenal. So the experiences, the good experiences are out there, and you need to be prepared to engage with that and basically break things, fix them, and tell people about it in a responsible way. And it really comes down to your friends and networking and building up a Rolodex of people and information. And one of the best places to do that is on a Tuesday night or on a Saturday hackathon down at the Space. So that's kind of all I've got. Thank you very much. You guys have been amazing. You even laughed at some of my off-color jokes, which is good. And I just want to tell you that the Skullscapes guys were a little bit nervous, and the CDC and the BSides guys were a little bit nervous because they actually gave me a white list of things that I was allowed to talk about, not a black list about what I was talking about. So my default was denied, but I managed to go through it without any vagina jokes. So that was really good for me. Yeah, so I have exactly, like 5 minutes for questions or 0 minutes? I have 3 minutes for questions, so if somebody has a question, you hit me up. Oh, one thing I wanted to talk about is this giant beer. Did I talk about that? I did? Okay. Well, I'm going to remind you about this giant beer then. You can purchase yours for $9, $1 of which goes to the Canadian Cyber Defense Challenge, and we appreciate your support in more ways than one. Thank you very much, guys.